You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
This is Koyama, author of Persecution and Toleration, A Long Road to Religious Freedom.
And this is Noel Johnson, the co-author on the book.
Persecution and Toleration, A Long Road to Religious Freedom is a book about the origins of liberalism, but from the angle of religious freedom. So most of us live in liberal societies, or at least societies which aspire to be liberal. So it's hard to understand how we got here. It's hard to understand how we went from a world where no one thought that religious freedom or liberalism in general were particularly good ideas. People believe that, of course, if there's one true religion, we should be able to compel everyone to adhere to it. Now, almost no people in liberal Western societies believe in that type of religious compulsion. So the question is, how do we get from this world of intolerance to this world of liberalism and tolerance and religious freedom? And that's what we try and do in this book. The main difference or original contribution of our argument compared to maybe some of the other arguments you've encountered or people have encountered on this topic is that we place a lot of emphasis on institutional change. So as institutional economic historians, we develop arguments which stress the change in the incentives that individuals faced, and those changing incentives then produce different behavior. This contrasts with an alternative approach which might emphasize the contribution of changing ideas. So an ideas-based argument might place a lot of emphasis on the distinctive contributions of particular liberal thinkers, perhaps John Locke, Pierre Bayle, Voltaire, who argued for religious toleration and religious freedom. In our story, you've got to get behind the incentives facing political actors, particularly rulers, to understand why it was that liberal ideas were persuasive in the 18th and 19th century, but were not persuasive earlier. So as we document in the book, there are many instances of thinkers or philosophers coming up with arguments for religious pluralism, toleration in the ancient world, in the Middle Ages, or in the early modern period, and mostly being ignored for political reasons. So our story is an institutional account of this transformation. We emphasize a transition from a world where government was based on identity rules which treated people differently based on their religious or ethnic identity, to a world of more general rules, and a transition from a world where states were extremely weak and fragmented and unstable, to a world where states are relatively secure, collect predictable amounts of taxation, and apply rules relatively generally. And also the final element of this transformation is we've gone from a world where religion is not just a private affair, but religion matters for the state and for polities, to a world where that's no longer the case. It's no longer the case that religion plays a key role in legitimizing political authority. So those three transitions, those three changes, were crucial in our argument for the origin, for why liberalism arose in Western Europe and North America.
Well, I think we came to it when Mark was hired at George Mason, which was a couple years after I was. We started working on our project together on witchcraft trials in Old Regime France, a paper that we eventually ended up putting in the Journal of Law and Economics. And in the course of doing that paper, we worked well together. And I forget what did we do right after that? There was witch trials, and then
we wrote a paper on the origins of tax farming in England and France, so the origins of investments in state capacity. Right. We also wrote a paper on heresy and the role of state plays in either enforcing and punishing religious deviants, or in tacitly tolerating them. That was published in the Journal of Comparative Economics. But I think so. We began working, I guess, together as soon as I arrived in George Mason, as Noel said, in 2011, and those papers went along pretty well. But they were building on, I would say, they're building on research themes which, for both of us, go back further. So Noel was working on, as he'll probably talk about, topics of state capacity, mostly in France, in early modern France, going back, I guess, to your dissertation. And in my dissertation, I had worked on the problem of like usury prohibitions in medieval Europe and rent seeking, and how these usury prohibitions led to like, in the case of England, expulsion of Jewish populations. And I was interested in, so I was also interested in state capacity, like Noel was, but I was also interested in religion. And I guess these projects we worked on initially, looking at witches and heretics, were all leading to this, to bringing these two things together, which I think is what we do in the book.
Yep.
And then I think the key kind of theme which allowed us to kind of really tie these things in was when we had the great fortune to kind of work on this paper on Jewish pogroms and colder weather shocks. So this paper, I guess I can talk about it more. Is we now, well, it's about how minorities were vulnerable in medieval and early modern Europe when the economy was doing badly. So it's essentially a test of a scapegoating theory. So when the economy is doing badly, perhaps because of the harvest is bad, or the growing season climate has been bad, Jews were more likely to be persecuted. So that paper allowed us to kind of combine a lot of these interests, because it's looking at the fate of a minority community, but it's also looking at how that fate is shaped by the political institutions they're living in, so the types of states they're living in. And we found, actually, that the vulnerability of Jewish communities to these types of pogroms induced by supply shocks, was greatest in the Middle Ages, and greatest in particularly in weak states, and that relationship weakened over time, so that by the end of the period we study, even though they're still sometimes pogroms, they were no longer related to these local supply shocks. And so I think once we wrote that paper, we had all the ingredients to try and tie it together into a larger theory or larger framework, which would become a book. Of course, that's easier said than done, and it's taken us, many years really to kind of put this all together and publish Persecution and Toleration.
Yeah, and I would just add at least for me, initially, the work on witch trials and the tax farming, I was more interested in the state capacity, state building angle to study things, and Mark brought much more the religion side, although you were interested in both things. And the project gradually evolved. The witches paper I was writing for when I was working towards a failed dissertation in a history program at Cornell that I dropped out of. I remember drafting that paper in the library of the Pompidou Center, many years ago. But we changed it a great deal. But again, but once I think Mark's right. Once we got to the paper on the temperature shocks, that paper really brought together a lot of the themes. And I think it was at that point that we started thinking more about writing a book on it. And initially, the book was going to be about the development of general rules and state capacity, and religion was much less involved with it. But then we realized that we kept on writing on Jewish persecution and heresy trials and things like this, and so religion was a natural place for us to go once that happened.
So the project evolved over the course of several years. I think Noel's already touched on some of the ways we ended up bringing in more topics of religion. I've always been for many years been a member of ASREC, attending his conference on the economics of religion. So over time, both of us saw more and more synergies with work done by other scholars in the field. So we were kind of influenced by that in a very productive way. So Timur Kuran, who's the book series editor, he's also involved in the economics of religion, looking at the Islamic Middle East. But many of the concepts he was working with and developing arguments he was building were relevant for us. Similarly, Jared Rubin, who also has a book on religion and institutions in Europe and the Middle East, his book developed complementary themes. So as we were working on the papers, we began to kind of articulate a more general framework for thinking about this transition from what we call a world of identity rules to a world of general rules, and that really was that was key to this project, because what the book is not just a collection of our essays. It's not a collection of papers. It's at least aspires to be an original, coherent, single argument which takes us from the Middle Ages to the modern period.
So the way the book is structured, we think of the development of liberal concept of religious freedom emerging in the West as having three historical phases. And initially, during the Middle Ages, up until around 1500 or 1600 or so, around the time of the Reformation, that was the world of conditional toleration. So identity rules, which are were rules used to govern. So for example, if you were a Jew, then you had different rules applied to you by governments than if you were a non-Jew. If you were a man, you were treated differently than a woman. If you were a member of a certain guild, you were treated differently than if you were not part of that guild. And so this is a very different way of governing than we have today, where rules are, at least in principle, supposed to be applied uniformly across different groups and not tied to, for example, their personal beliefs about religion. So in that initial phase, that was an equilibrium that we describe in the sense that states found it very, or governments found it very convenient to use those rules and cheap to use those identity rules in order to do things that governments do, like collect revenue so that they could fight war or provide public goods, of which there were much fewer at that time. If you think about it, if you can treat Jews differently, but then give them the right to lend money, for example, they can make profits from lending that money, but then you can also, as a government, tax away that money from the Jews. So this is something that Mark can probably speak to, that equilibrium. This was part of your dissertation, right, this work? So maybe you should describe.
I can. This is kind of a rent-seeking equilibrium. So the existence of general prohibition on usury, which is religious in origin. So they're statements in the Bible and Deuteronomy, which basically outlaw or outlaw interest taking as usury, all interest, not just high interest rates like we might define usury today. And so this widely shared antipathy towards money lending, distrust of money lending, belief that money lending is akin to theft because the lender is kind of stealing, is taking more than he's giving. So that belief, which is widespread in a lot of pre-modern societies in medieval Europe, becomes more and more binding as a commercial economy is growing. So after 1100, there's a commercial revolution, trade is expanding, markets are expanding, opportunities for investment are going up. However, to make use of those opportunities, you need to borrow money, and you often need to borrow. And it's going to make sense for the lender to want to get a return on this money, especially if there's a lot of risk involved. So that situation produces a tension whereby there's a huge pent-up demand for credit, but supply is very constrained because of the usury laws, and rulers are looking for ways around this. And the Jewish populations offered a ready way to circumvent the usury restrictions, and rulers gradually discovered an extremely lucrative source of revenue. So this was particularly well developed in England in the 13th century, where Jewish money lending became basically a monopoly. So Christian money lenders were expropriated and got rid of. Jewish money lenders were forced to lend through a royal institution called the Exchequer of a Jury. Every debt was tallied and recorded so that you couldn't surreptitiously lend money off a box. The king's officials would know every loan which was being made, and therefore they would have some sense of how rich or how much money each individual Jewish community in England, whether the community of Leicester or Oxford or London, how much money they would have. And in the event that the king needed immediate revenue, in these days there's no public debt. The king can't really borrow money, the state can't borrow money. The king's ability to borrow money is very limited because people know he's a king, hence he can afford to imprison someone who demands that he repays the loan. In that situation, the king's ability to raise taxes is very limited. This is before there's a widespread acceptance of general taxation. So the most immediate source of funds the king has is the Exchequer of a Jury. He can basically expropriate whatever profit the Jews are making from money lending. So this is like the most extreme form, I guess, of how identity rules, conditional toleration, and weak states interact. And it's a situation which gives the king a reason to protect the Jewish community to some degree. So it's consistent with the existence of a minority community. They're not being, at least for most of this period, not being totally destroyed. But it's also totally incompatible with any religious freedom or any general liberalism.
And I should mention, one of the beautiful parts of the story, of the Mark story about the Jews, is that this economic equilibrium also reinforces a cultural equilibrium of anti-Semitism. If, for example, you see Jews in this privileged position of being able to lend money, and it reinforces stereotypes, of Jews, as Shylocks, and things like this, which also makes it easier for the government to expropriate the Jews in the case that they might need to. So it makes the collection of taxes even easier. So it's this nice example of economics and culture coming together and being reinforced together. But this is not just, the book is not just a story about Jewish communities as well, we should emphasize. So for example, you can also think of many tax farming arrangements, which is highly decentralized way of collecting taxes, where you basically auction off the right to individuals to do it, as being another sort of equilibrium that's related to this. You could think about guilds, which are going to be a source of revenue for states as well and cities. But in order to be a part of a guild, you often have to have certain religious beliefs, adhere to certain saints, for example. And you're also going to be given privileged treatment, and so these are also an example of identity rules that are tied to religion that are also making it possible to govern in a limited way. Now, that's just the first phase, right? And then what we describe in the book is the breakdown in what we call this conditional toleration equilibrium. And this breakdown is coming about for two primary reasons. One is that there's a military revolution that is in full force by the 16th century, and that's making it more expensive to fight wars. And so this means that governments are confronted with with either failure or with raising enough money to do things like build big castles with Truss Italian, structure, or to get cannon, in the field and things like this. But that means they have to raise revenue, and they can't raise enough revenue through these old organizational equilibria that they had using the identity rules. The other main historical event that is leading to the breakdown in this conditional toleration equilibrium is the Reformation in our story. Mark, did you want to talk about the Reformation?
So the Reformation is increasing religious heterogeneity at a local level. And of course, we don't view the Reformation as a purely exogenous shock. It's not like people's religious beliefs suddenly change, but it's certainly the conjunction of new ideas critical of the Catholic Church and the technology of a printing press, which is giving people like Martin Luther unprecedented ability to disseminate his criticisms of the Catholic Church. That's changing the underlying kind of distribution of religious beliefs across European societies in different ways, and it's making it harder for the states to govern based on reliance on religious legitimacy, conditional toleration, and kind of identity rules. So, for example, a country like England, in 1500, everyone is nominally, almost everyone, there are a few Lollard heretics, but basically everyone is nominally a Catholic. That doesn't mean they're all like perfect Catholics or they necessarily know a lot of doctrine, but nominally they're Catholic. So when the Catholic Church legitimizes or delegitimizes a ruler, it's pretty straightforward. There's one Catholic Church. If the Catholic Church is on the side of the king, that gives the king a lot of legitimacy. What happens after the Reformation is the English crown switches religion several times. So Henry VIII divorces Catherine of Aragon, marries Anne Boleyn, makes England Protestant. His son is also Protestant, but Mary, his daughter, switches the country back to Catholicism, and Elizabeth returns it to former Protestantism. At each point when they're switching, there's going to be a large chunk of a population who do not adhere to the religion of the crown anymore. So there are a large proportion of Catholics who are a minority during Elizabeth's reign, and that's a source of political instability. Even though the vast majority of Catholics were undoubtedly loyal to the crown, there are some who are not. The Pope declares the Queen a traitor, usurper, heretic, and hence legitimizing assassination attempts against her. Following this, the attitude of the English state is to view all Catholics as potential fifth columnists and traitors. So this is having the effect of calling into question the value of religion as a legitimating force for the state. At the same time, as Noel described, the military revolution is happening basically simultaneously. And so at the same time, there's all this pressure to raise revenues in new ways, make rules more general, and that that in the 17th and 18th century, that produces a different set of incentives for rulers. So our story is very much an institutional economic story. It's a story where it's not that individuals are better or worse or more or less tolerant. It's that they face different incentives at different points in time. By the 17th century and certainly the 18th century, rulers face incentives which incline them to increasingly turn a blind eye to religious differences and religious problems and focus on ways to raise revenue. So a key example of this is Oliver Cromwell. Oliver Cromwell has very strong religious beliefs. He's an independent, or we would call a Puritan, but he's keen. He doesn't persecute Catholics in particular. He doesn't want religious persecution. And when there's an opportunity to invite the Jews to return to England, having been absent for 300 years, he does so, and predominantly we think on kind of fiscal grounds. He sees this as an opportunity to basically attract a prosperous merchant community, a community who will help fund him wars against Spain or other Catholic powers. Similarly, Cardinal Richelieu in France, again, he's not a liberal ruler. He's not we don't have to claim anything. He's an ambitious mercantilist who wants to maximize the power of a French state. But when a population of Portuguese conversos, so these are Jews who had converted to Catholicism but who are being persecuted by the Inquisition in Spain, when they arrive in Bordeaux, he basically instructs local authorities to not investigate their religious beliefs whatsoever. Why? Because they're important for raising money to help him fight the Spanish. So the incentives have changed after the Reformation, after the military revolution, in such a way that rulers are going to be focusing on ways to raise revenue, and they're going to turn a blind eye to religious deviance or religious kind of differences, and that's going to provide an institutional environment which is going to allow more liberal ideas about religion and religious freedom, and then liberalism more generally to emerge.
And we should emphasize as well that one reason this is a book, and we felt that this story could not be told in academic papers, is because there is historical contingency involved in the whole story. The incentives change for states. Once you have the military revolution and the Reformation, the incentives change so that they are more inclined, or they're confronted with heterogeneity of religious belief that if they want to raise revenues in order to survive, they must deal with. One way to deal with it is by relaxing the bounds of what's considered to be religious deviance in the states. But another response could have been to persecute or destroy, the religious deviants, as happened, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. When the Spain and a few years later the Portuguese expel all the Jewish communities from there. So it wasn't the case that all states embraced religious freedom, but the incentives increased, and some of them did. I think I was surprised by the result that Mark already described with the temperature shocks and Jewish persecution. That paper, it's based on about 1,800 cities, I believe, across Europe, and then there's less. So that's the number of cities that you have population data. That paper has about 900, I believe, cities where you knew Jewish communities were in at one point, and it covers a period of 800 years. And the temperature data are yearly, so you have information based on tree rings and pollen counts and other proxy measures of temperature that tell you what the growing season temperature was for every city for every year over that 800-year period, from 1000 until about 1800. And so that we actually get the result, that the yearly, a abnormally cold growing season a year leads to a significant, both economically and statistically, increase in the probability of persecution of Jewish community. That did surprise me, just because of the breadth of the study involved. Yeah.
I think one thing which surprised me, not necessarily as we were finalizing the book, but at least going into the project, was that had you discussed with either of us perhaps 10 years ago what we were interested in, we would have said state formation and provides institutions which are conducive to like liberal societies and markets. But I actually, both of us, I think, we're not focusing on religion per se as much at the time, and so the story would have been more like along the lines of maybe the work of Douglas North or Darren Asamoah and James Robinson, which is scholars who all offer institutional accounts of how societies change, but they don't emphasize religion. Religion is not very important in their story. What I was surprised by, I guess, as I was reading things and putting together the various arguments, is the extent to which religion is very important in all of these political changes, in a way that, like us, after the transformation, after the transition we're describing, it's very hard for us to understand because we tend to think of religion as a private thing, like people have their religious beliefs, but that's not relevant for how polities operate. But it turns out when you read about the English Civil War, the conflicts between the Crown and Parliament in England in the 17th century, these are not secular discussions. They're essentially almost religious wars. Every side is defined by different religious policy. So religion is really important, and the more you read about the history, the more you see this. So, I mean, a key part of the Glorious Revolution was the prohibition of Catholics from attaining the throne. So, for example, after the Glorious Revolution, English monarchs were not allowed to marry Catholics, I think, until 2010. That's when it was changed. The law was changed, and that's not how economists in the North Weingast tradition normally think about the Glorious Revolution. We think about the Glorious Revolution as the imposition of restraints on the arbitrary power of the monarch, and Parliament getting more power to control taxation and spending. We don't think of it as this religious thing, right? Why is there a religious component to the Glorious Revolution? Well, it turns out it was absolutely crucial because, given the particular political economy of England at the time, Catholicism was associated with arbitrary rule and absolutism, and so one of the ways you safeguard limited government was through ensuring a Protestant succession. Similarly, an example which I'm thinking about for kind of a follow-up paper, this is not in the book, is Catholic emancipation. So one of the things we do note in the book is that Catholics had extremely severe disabilities placed on them throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So legally, at least, Catholics could not inherit land. Catholic marriages were not recognized in law. So you'd have to have a Protestant marriage even if you were Catholic. And Catholics were barred from the army, they couldn't be lawyers, they couldn't work for government, they couldn't be members of parliament. And this only changes really late in English history. It changes in 1828. And why did it take so long? Turns out it's a very kind of complicated story. But bottom line is that even in the 18th century, even in the period when the Industrial Revolution is taking place, the English Constitution is a constitution where religion and the state are still tied together. There's still identity rules distinguishing Catholics and Protestants, and those identity rules are part of the way they're giving privileges to the Protestants. So Protestants are privileged, and that privilege allows them to know that the state will never become Catholic, and it gives the Church of England a lot of institutional power, and this changes very late in kind of British history. So that's something which I was kind of, the importance of religion to all of these discussions is not something I was aware of, and actually in a follow-up paper, that's one of the themes we'll mention, because the transition in Britain from an oligarchy to a liberal democracy, which takes place in the 19th century, and economists and political scientists view this in terms of a response to the Industrial Revolution, a response to the demands of the poor for redistribution. If you read some of the history, it has a religious component too, because it's associated with this transition from identity rules to general rules. It's exactly the time when Britain's becoming a liberal democracy that they're giving equality to Catholics and to Jews and to atheists.
So I think what Mark just described is a research program, or many research programs, that students could pick up. The extent to which religion is a vital component of almost any study of institutions in the pre-modern period, that is, in the period before, say, the end of the 19th century in Western Europe, is just huge. And that's one of the big things that comes out of the book. And also, there are many questions that the book leaves unanswered that would be nice to have answers to. The book, for example, we began writing it thinking that the book was going to be about the rise of state capacity and the development of general rules. And how do you get property rights more secure, these sorts of questions. that question, I think, is probably forever going to be out there. We're not going to solve it, but there's a lot of work that can be done. Just to give you an example, we do have one story in the book we tell about the development of state capacity in France, where we discuss it being based on, where the state was taxing more, then French people started thinking of themselves more as French. The problem, though, with this sort of story is that these locations where the state is also having higher taxation and people are identifying more as French by, say, the end of the 18th century, those are also, these borders correspond to also linguistic borders. And this is very often something that we run into in economics and historical research, that the thing we want to argue is causing one thing to something else is also going to be correlated with other things. And I think this question about state building, about how much of it is due to things like policy of states that are molding people's preferences versus how much is coming from something that is deeper, potentially linguistic, or something even deeper than that potentially. Those are questions which I think are being very actively pursued right now by people. But in general, just these questions of state formation are very important, and focusing on the religious aspect also is something that students could take.
The only thing I'd add is that there's a lot of great work now in the economics of religion, or specifically to the economic history of religion. So this is not a field which really existed as a coherent field 10, 15 years ago. But if you look at recent papers presented at conferences like ASRAC or other conferences, work by Jared Rubin, Sasha Becker, Jeremiah Detmar, many other scholars on the economic history of religion. And Timur Kuran, who I've already mentioned, that people are doing great work on how these things interact. And I think it's an important part of understanding institutional change.
And then one last thing, at least on this question, our book is focused on Europe, even though we do talk at some length about China, Japan, and the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Middle East. But the importance of religion to the development of liberal values, the question of how this has evolved or failed to evolve in places that aren't Europe is a super interesting question that deserves a lot more attention from scholars.
Yeah, so we've touched on these comparisons, I think, but we don't solve them. So, like, why is it that a society like China, why is it religion is less important, legitimizing state authority? That's a question we can't fully answer in this book, but obviously other scholars with more kind of area expertise than us could work on that question.
I enjoy working with Mark. Mark is a very tolerant co-author.
I think, collaboration, it requires like a degree of trust between the two co-authors. So that's, there are many different ways one can collaborate on a research project. There are many different models, and we also have other co-authors who we also collaborate with, and sometimes in similar or different ways. So every collaboration is different in some sense. Some level of trust and willingness to forgive each other, like typos and mistakes, and also to overlook kind of it. Be willing to negotiate and to discuss, because you learn stuff from discussing it with someone else. So I think it's a huge benefit to having co-authors you can actually talk the ideas over with. There's certainly a benefit being in the same institution, or at least being geographically proximate, because we can actually fight over some ideas or discuss things in person. Whereas if we were geographically separate, it would be much less convenient to do so.
Yeah, I was just going to mention we have great colleagues surrounding us, and also we're lucky that George Mason put us in offices that were across the hall from each other, which makes it, I don't even have to get up from my computer to yell at Mark, and then Mark can yell at me without getting up from his computer in good ways. So.
And we've had other students and other co-authors on these projects as well.
So Mark, this has been a fun conversation. Thanks for chatting with me about it.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it greatly, Noel. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.